On the morning of Thursday, April 24, 2026, a former mayor of a small Texas town named Blanco walked into a room on Capitol Hill carrying 16 years of field research, 80 hours of filmed testimony from IDP camps, and the names of Nigerian officials he was about to call criminals before the most powerful legislature on earth. He walked out carrying something he did not expect, a legal and factual problem that threatens to undermine the very case he came to make. The bombshell he dropped in Washington had already gone viral before his plane landed home. But what the headlines missed, what almost every Nigerian outlet missed, is the gap between what Mike Arnold said and what Mike Arnold can actually prove. And that gap is the story. Most channels gave you the headline and moved on. We stay until we find the architecture underneath it. If you have never been here before, you just found the channel that tells you what the headline was designed to hide. Subscribe now, because what comes next is the part the Nigerian government's Washington lobbyists are hoping you never connect. The sequence of events matters here more than most people realize. By early 2024, Arnold, founder of Africa Arise International, author of a book on Nigeria and radical Islam, and a man who describes Nigeria as his second home, had already concluded that what was happening in northern and middle belt Nigeria met the legal threshold for genocide under the UN Convention. He reached out to Representative Michael McCall, then chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, to escalate his findings. That outreach produced results. McCall called up House Resolution 82, which formally expressed the sense of Congress that Nigeria should be redesignated as a country of particular concern for religious freedom violations. On Wednesday, March 12, 2025, Arnold gave sworn testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa at a formally convened open hearing titled Conflict and Persecution in Nigeria, the case for a CPC designation. That testimony is in the Congressional Record. It is public. It is searchable. Arnold spoke specifically to the persecution of Christian farming communities, the treatment of Nnamdi Kanu, and the selectivity of Nigeria's security enforcement. Then came October 2025. The Nigerian government flew Arnold to Abuja for what he has described publicly as a propaganda tour, a government-arranged press conference designed to produce a useful American endorsing their security narrative. Arnold says he updated his will before boarding the plane. What he did at the Abuja Hilton on Tuesday, October 14, 2025, was the opposite of what Abuja expected. He seized the microphone and declared a genocide was actively occurring in Nigeria. The Nigerian Senate convened in emergency session the same day. By April 2026, the United States had redesignated Nigeria as a country of particular concern for religious freedom violations. Trump had made public statements about military options. 200 U.S. troops had arrived at Bauchi airfield, and MQ-9 Reaper drones had been deployed over northern Nigeria. That is the backdrop against which Arnold returned to Capitol Hill. On Thursday, April 24, 2026, multiple Nigerian outlets, including Sahara Reporters, reported Arnold had testified before a U.S. Congressional Committee calling for the indictment and arrest of President Tinubu and his cabinet. The phrase, "indict the Tinubu administration, arrest them," spread across social media within hours. A YouTube broadcast of what appears to be a Capitol Hill briefing from the same date shows Arnold delivering those remarks in a congressional setting. Here is the first precision the headlines skipped entirely. We come to that in the next section. Why did this happen on that specific Thursday and not a month earlier or a month later? The answer is the FOIA clock. On April 8, 2025, almost exactly a year before Arnold's April 2026 appearance, U.S. District Court Judge Beryl Hall had ordered the FBI and the DEA to stop hiding behind their so-called GLOMA responses, their refusals to confirm or deny the existence of records. U.S. District Court Judge Beryl Hole ruled that their position was, in her exact phrase, neither logical nor plausible, given that both agencies had already officially acknowledged Tinubu as a subject of their investigation in other filings. Aaron Greenspan, the American activist who filed the original FOIA lawsuit, had been pushing for release of these files since 2023. Arnold's own website references a June 1, 2026 court-ordered deadline for the FBI and DEA to produce records on what he describes as Tinubu's heroin trafficking investigation. Arnold's April 2026 congressional appearance came 6 weeks before that deadline. It was not accidental timing. It was designed to prime the information environment to ensure that when those files arrive, Congress has already been told what to look for, and Nigerian public opinion has already been given a frame through which to receive them. The electoral dimension compounds this. Nigeria's 2027 general elections are now less than 12 months from their primary season. The U.S. government, with troops, drones, sanctions legislation, and a CPC designation, now has more direct formal leverage over Nigeria's political trajectory than at any point since the Obasanjo era. The Tinubu administration has spent, according to Blaze Media, over $10 million on Washington lobbyists. One of those lobbyists is reported to be a former Trump State Department advisor, now registered as a foreign agent of Nigeria. Arnold understands this arithmetic better than most. He is not operating in a vacuum. He is operating in a pressure system. But what I just told you is the version that makes Arnold's intervention look like pure strategic maneuver. What is actually happening is more complicated, and one layer deeper is where the accountability questions really live. Here is the technical core of what Arnold said on April 24, 2026, and what the evidence record actually supports. Arnold told the congressional audience that President Tinubu, whom he prefaced with the phrase, "if that is his real name," forfeited $460,000 to a U.S. court in 1993, linked to a heroin trafficking ring. He called for the Tinubu administration to be indicted and arrested, describing the administration as guilty of genocide and calling the Nigerian situation the moral equivalent of the Third Reich. Read those three claims separately because they are doing three completely different things legally and evidentially. The $460,000 forfeiture is not in dispute as a matter of documented record. Case number 93C4483, Northern District of Illinois, is publicly accessible. A verified complaint filed by the U.S. Department of Justice on July 26, 1993, sought civil forfeiture of funds held in Tinubu's name at First Heritage Bank on the grounds that an IRS special agent named Kevin Moss had established probable cause that those funds represent proceeds of drug trafficking. Tinubu agreed to the forfeiture. The APC's own legal team defending Tinubu at the 2023 Presidential Elections Petitions Court confirmed this, but argued that the settlement terms included an express admission on record that Tinubu did not admit any drug-related conduct. He was never charged with a criminal offense. A 2003 FBI NCIC records obtained by the Nigerian government through the U.S. consulate in Lagos returned negative for any criminal arrest records, warrants or warrants. What this means precisely is the following. The forfeiture is documented. The characterization of it as proof of criminal conduct by Tinubu personally is contested and legally unresolved. Arnold presented the former as though it established the latter. It does not yet, and not with the files that are not yet public. Now read the second claim slowly. Indict the Tinubu administration, arrest them, they are guilty of genocide, and it is provable.
The legal threshold for genocide under Article 2 of the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide requires two things to be established simultaneously: specific acts from an enumerated list and intent to destroy a group as such. The intent element is the hardest evidentiary burden in international law. Arnold says it is provable, but provable and proven are not the same thing. Arnold has not produced to date a document establishing that Nigerian state actors have ordered or coordinated attacks on Christians with the specific intent to destroy them as a group. What he has produced is extensive documentation of attacks, displacement, and impunity, all of which are real, all of which are serious, and none of which, standing alone, satisfies the intent standard. The CSIS analysis submitted to the same House Foreign Affairs Committee at the March 2025 hearing explicitly noted that religion is often a secondary factor in Nigeria's internal violence rather than its primary driver.
The gap between "this is happening" and "this is genocide with state intent" is not a small one. It is the entire legal case. There is a third layer. Arnold described his April 2026 appearance as a congressional testimony. Multiple major Nigerian outlets reported it as testimony before a U.S. Congressional Committee. But the formal record of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa does not, as of this recording, list a sworn open hearing on Nigeria for April 24, 2026. What appears to have occurred is a congressional briefing, a different mechanism carrying no sworn testimony status, no formal evidentiary record, and no committee resolution. The distinction matters for one specific reason. Calling for the arrest of a sitting head of state carries very different legal and diplomatic weight as sworn congressional testimony versus as a voluntary briefing that a congressman may have hosted. Arnold himself appears to have understood this. His public materials describe a sustained campaign that includes formal hearings, briefings, book launches, media appearances, and a documentary. April 24 appears to have been one node in that campaign, not the formal congressional hearing it was reported as. None of this makes the underlying concerns false. It makes the framing of the intervention something that demands precision. If what I just laid out changes how you see this story, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you stood before this video, because what comes next is going to change it again. Let us now look at what this entire development does strategically for each of the actors involved. For Arnold, the April 2026 appearance does three things simultaneously. First, it maintains his position as the primary American civilian voice on the Nigeria genocide question at exactly the moment when the U.S. government is making consequential policy decisions about Nigeria. Second, it inserts the Tinubu drug forfeiture narrative into the congressional bloodstream 6 weeks before the FBI/DEA file disclosure deadline, ensuring that any released documents will be received within a pre-established frame. Third, it anchors the Arrest Tinubu call to a Capitol Hill setting, which Nigerian media will inevitably describe as congressional testimony regardless of the technical distinction, giving it the authority of an institutional location. For the Tinubu administration, this event lands on three open fronts at once. First, the FOIA front. Files may be released by June 1, 2026 that have been sealed for 3 decades. The government cannot control what is in them. Second, the Congressional Appropriations Front. The House Appropriations Committee had already passed a State Department funding bill conditioning U.S. assistance to Nigeria on accountability metrics. Congressman Riley Moore's direct statement that the Tinubu administration was spending millions lobbying Congress while failing to address killings is now in the public record. Third, the Military Posture Front. U.S. troops, drones, and a naval vessel in the Gulf of Guinea represent a level of physical proximity that lobbying dollars cannot neutralize.
The Tinubu government is running 4 simultaneous pressure responses. Diplomatic, the foreign minister's dismissal of the genocide claim as a distorted narrative. Lobbying, the $10.0 million Washington operation. Legal, intervention in the FOIA case citing privacy interests. And domestic framing. First Lady Oluremi Tinubu's February 2026 CBN interview rejecting the systematic extermination claim. Everything I just told you about this political calculation assumes one thing is true, that the FBI and DEA files, when they arrive, will be damaging enough to shift the balance. I want to test that assumption now.
Zoom out from the individuals to the structure. What this episode demonstrates beyond the specific Nigerian case is a pattern that appears in multiple African governance contexts. The asymmetry between the speed at which an allegation can travel in American political discourse and the speed at which a government can mount a counter-narrative. Arnold's Indict Tinubu claim was across Nigerian social media within hours. The 27-page CSIS rebuttal, which engaged the same congressional committee with equal seriousness and considerably more methodological caution, did not trend on any platform. This is not a Nigerian problem. It is a democracies under international scrutiny problem, and Nigeria is demonstrating it publicly at the highest level of visibility in its post-independence history. The international read of this situation is not uniform. In Washington's evangelical and conservative policy circles, Arnold is operating with significant credibility. The Center for Security Policy's Frank Gaffney has described him in terms bordering on reverence. In London, European Union capitals, and among Nigeria's African neighbors, the framing is being watched with considerably more caution. The concern is whether the U.S. is building a legitimate human rights case or constructing a pretext architecture. That distinction will matter for Tinubu's ability to sustain multilateral partnerships, secure IMF program support, and manage the Naira stabilization effort that is currently one of his administration's few quantifiable economic achievements. Nigeria's Abuja correspondents at international news organizations are watching this story very carefully. Tinubu's international reputational exposure is now material, not symbolic. Now, let me make the case for the side I have been scrutinizing. Arnold's critics, including the Nigerian government, Rino Omokri, and the Jamaat Nasril Islam, have consistently argued that framing the Middle Belt violence as a Christian genocide distorts a complex, multi-causal security failure into a religious war frame that inflames tensions rather than resolving them. They point to the Global Terror Index, which showed overall deaths from terrorism in Nigeria declining from 7,512 in 2015 to 565 in 2024. They argue that Fulani herder farmer violence is driven primarily by climate displacement, land pressure, and the collapse of traditional mediation structures, not by religious conquest ideology. They also raise a legitimate governance critique. If the Arnold Cruz genocide framing gains enough traction in Washington to produce punitive measures against the Nigerian state, the communities most likely to suffer the consequences of reduced U.S. security assistance, aid conditionality, and military escalation are the very displaced Christian communities Arnold says he is trying to protect. This is not a trivial counter-argument. There is also a data point that complicates Arnold's own framing. Arnold has said repeatedly that he would support any candidate, Tinubu, Peter Obi, or anyone else who genuinely champions the cause of IDP communities. He has said publicly in a Punch interview from November 2025 that he does not know the internal dynamics of Nigerian political parties and cannot tell you what they stand for or who is who. A man who acknowledges that level of political ignorance about Nigeria while calling for the arrest of its president from a Capitol Hill platform is operating in an evidentiary space that deserves honest examination. The real battle is in the next 6 weeks when those FBI and DEA files either arrive
or don't, and I do not know yet what is in them. For the Tinubu administration, 3 paths are now visible. Path 1 is transparent engagement. Tinubu publicly invests in a credible, internationally verifiable accountability process for Middle Belt violence. A special tribunal, a UN observer mechanism, or a joint Nigerian International Commission with genuine independence. This path neutralizes Arnold's core charge by demonstrating that the Nigerian state is moving, however imperfectly, toward accountability. It is politically costly domestically. Path 2 is lobbying and delay. The current posture, which bets that Washington's attention will shift, that the FBI and DEA files will either be underwhelming or legally neutralized, and that the 2027 election cycle will produce a political reset. This path is working at the margins but is structurally fragile because it depends on the FBI and DEA files containing nothing that changes the equilibrium.
Path 3 is the path that ends his administration as currently constituted. The released files contain something new, not the already public 1993 forfeiture, but something from the sealed DEA and FBI investigations that connects Tinubu to conduct that cannot be framed as a civil settlement. At that point, the lobbying architecture collapses, the U.S. security relationship enters genuine rupture, and the 2027 election becomes a national security referendum. 3 signals to watch. Signal 1. Whether the FBI and DEA comply with the June 1, 2026 disclosure deadline or seek another extension. If they comply, it means the Trump administration has decided the files should be in the public domain. If they seek another extension, it means either the files are more sensitive than reported or Nigerian diplomatic pressure has found a lever in the executive branch. The direction of that decision will tell you more about U.S.-Nigeria relations than any diplomatic statement. Signal 2. Whether Congress schedules a formal, sworn, open hearing on Nigeria with Arnold as a named witness in the next 90 days. A briefing is informal. A sworn hearing is a different mechanism. It creates an evidentiary record, it enables cross-examination, and it obliges committee members to take positions. If that hearing is scheduled, it signals that the House Foreign Affairs Committee is moving from awareness to action. If it is not scheduled, it signals that Arnold's influence, while real, has not yet reached the threshold that requires institutional response. Signal 3. Whether the Tinubu government appoints a competent Nigerian ambassador to Washington before the FOIA files are released. This was specifically recommended by the CSIS witness at the March 2025 hearing. Nigeria currently has no ambassador in Washington during the most consequential period of U.S.-Nigeria relations in decades. If one is appointed quickly, it signals a genuine attempt to manage the relationship at the highest level. If the position remains vacant, it signals either paralysis or a calculation that the problem cannot be managed diplomatically. At the beginning of this video, I told you that Mike Arnold walked into a room on Capitol Hill carrying 16 years of field research and walked out carrying a problem he did not expect. That problem is this: the thing that makes Arnold most credible, his years in the field, his documented relationships with IDP communities, his schools, his refusal to be used as a propaganda prop in Abuja, is the thing that gives his congressional appearance its moral authority. But the thing that makes his April 2026 intervention most vulnerable is also the thing that gives it its viral power, the sweep of the claim. Indict the Tinubu administration, arrest them. 7 words that spread faster than any 27-page academic rebuttal ever will. The architecture underneath that sentence is precisely what the FBI and DEA files may or may not eventually support. If those files contain what Arnold believes they contain, history will record that a former mayor of Blanco, Texas, told Congress the truth before the documents arrived. If those files are more ambiguous than the headline suggests, the genocide designation, which rests on contested intent evidence, and the arrest call, which rests on an unresolved drug file, will face a credibility audit from which it will be very difficult to recover in time for 2027. Here is the prediction.
If the FBI and DEA do not file for another extension by July 1, 2026, watch for the Nigerian government to make a major domestic security announcement within the following 30 days. They will need to change the story. You now know something that most Nigerians watching the news tonight will never be told, not because it is hidden in a foreign archive, but because no one stopped to ask what the difference is between a congressional briefing and sworn testimony, between a civil forfeiture settlement and a criminal conviction, between documented atrocities and the specific legal threshold for genocide. Share this video with someone who only heard the 7 words. Make them watch the architecture. That is how accountability actually works, not in headlines, but in the gap between the claim and the evidence. Nigeria Unmasked, nothing stays hidden here. I will see you in the next one.